The sun hung low over the Grand Canyon, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson. Tourists lined the railings, their cameras clicking as they tried to capture the vast expanse of nature's raw beauty. Among the crowd was Mr. Clarence Johnson, an elderly man with a gentle demeanor, wearing his favorite brown hat and holding a walking cane carved with intricate designs. At 78 years old, he had dreamed of visiting the Grand Canyon his entire life. Today was meant to be special, a bucket list moment for a man who had spent decades serving his community as a teacher, mentor, and friend. Clarence stood at the edge of the viewing platform, marveling at the breathtaking vista before him. Nearby, a group of teenagers laughed and took selfies while families wrangled excited children. It was a peaceful, if busy scene, filled with the kind of wonder that only a place like the Grand Canyon could inspire. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the mood shifted. A uniformed police officer, his face stern and his movements abrupt, approached Clarence. Those nearby glanced up, curiosity flickering in their eyes. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his tone sharp. "I need to speak with you." Clarence turned slowly, leaning on his cane for support. His kind eyes met the officer's unyielding gaze, and he offered a polite smile. "Of course, officer. Is something wrong?" What followed was a tense exchange that no one quite understood. Witnesses later described the officer's behavior as unnecessarily aggressive, his voice loud enough to draw attention from the crowd. Clarence, for his part, remained calm, his soft-spoken words barely audible over the officer's booming commands. The energy in the air grew heavy, and murmurs began to ripple through the onlookers. Before anyone could fully grasp what was happening, the unthinkable occurred. The officer shoved Clarence with such force that he stumbled backward, his cane clattering to the ground. Gasps erupted as the elderly man teetered dangerously close to the canyon's edge. Time seemed to slow as Clarence flailed, his arms reaching out for something, anything, to hold on to. A woman screamed, a child cried. Phones were raised, recording the unfolding chaos. And then, in a single, heart-stopping moment, Clarence disappeared over the edge. The crowd froze, their shock palpable. Some people yelled, while others rushed to the railing, peering over with wide eyes. Below, the vast canyon stretched endlessly, its jagged cliffs and rocky outcroppings illuminated by the setting sun. But there was no sign of Clarence. As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, the officer stood rooted to the spot, his face pale and his expression unreadable. A young man in the crowd, trembling with anger, shouted, "Why did he do that? He was just standing there." Chaos erupted. People demanded answers, pointing fingers and shouting accusations. Some called 911, while others continued filming, determined to document every second of the incident. But the real shock was yet to come. Just as the crowd began to despair, something extraordinary happened, something no one could have anticipated. A strange sound echoed from the canyon below, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a scream or a cry for help. It was laughter, deep, rich, and unmistakably human. The crowd fell silent, straining their ears to hear more. Moments later, a figure appeared, climbing up the steep rock face with an agility that defied logic. It was Clarence. His brown hat was gone, and his clothes were dusty, but he was very much alive and smiling. As he reached the top and pulled himself over the edge, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Clarence stood, brushing himself off as if nothing had happened. Then, with a twinkle in his eye, he turned to the officer and said, "Well, that was quite the push, wasn't it?" What followed would be dissected, debated, and discussed for weeks to come. But in that moment, one thing was clear. Clarence Johnson was no ordinary man, and this was no ordinary story. And the real mystery was only just beginning. The crowd's applause was deafening as Clarence dusted himself off, his unshaken calm contrasting starkly with the pandemonium around him. His smile was soft but knowing, as if he understood something the rest of them didn't. Some people edged closer, desperate to ask him how he managed to survive the impossible. Others focused their phones on him, capturing every detail for what would undoubtedly become viral footage. The officer, still frozen in place, looked at Clarence with a mixture of disbelief and unease. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. His previously commanding demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a pale, uncertain silence. Clarence noticed this, and with a small chuckle patted the officer on the shoulder. "No harm done, young man," he said in his warm, grandfatherly tone. "But I think you owe me a new hat." His comment, so casual given the situation, only deepened the sense of bewilderment among the crowd. A murmur spread, people asking each other questions no one could answer. How had Clarence climbed back up so quickly? Was it even possible for someone his age to survive such a fall? And more importantly, why had the officer pushed him in the first place? "Sir," a bystander asked, stepping forward cautiously, "are you okay? How did you—" Clarence held up a hand, his kind eyes twinkling. Now, he said, "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Just a little dusty, that's all." The bystander hesitated, clearly wanting to press further, but unsure how to phrase the growing list of questions in their mind. Before anyone could say more, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Park rangers and additional law enforcement arrived on the scene, their vehicles pulling up in a flurry of flashing lights. Rangers jumped out, some rushing to secure the area near the cliff, others heading straight for the officer who had pushed Clarence. Their faces were tense, their voices low but firm as they began questioning him. Clarence stepped back, giving them space, but his expression didn't change. He seemed oddly detached, as if this entire ordeal was more of an inconvenience than anything serious. The lead park ranger, a stern woman with sharp eyes, approached Clarence. "Sir, are you injured?" she asked, her tone professional but genuinely concerned. "We need to get you checked out." "I appreciate the concern, ma'am," Clarence replied, "but I assure you I'm perfectly fine. I'd rather not waste anyone's time with unnecessary fuss." The ranger frowned, clearly skeptical. "With all due respect, you just fell, or were pushed, into the Grand Canyon. We need to understand how you survived and ensure you're not in shock or hiding injuries." Clarence's smile widened slightly. "You're kind to worry, but I've always been a quick climber. Comes from my younger days, I suppose. And as for the rest, well, let's just say I had my fair share of close calls in life. This wasn't my first, and I doubt it'll be my last." His words, though delivered with charm, only added to the growing sense of mystery. People exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from admiration to outright disbelief. Some whispered theories among themselves. Was he a retired stuntman, a survival expert, or was there something more unusual at play? Meanwhile, the officer who had shoved Clarence was being questioned at length. His responses were clipped and defensive, though his earlier confidence had evaporated. "I didn't mean for him to fall," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I was just trying to get him to step back from the edge. It all happened so fast." The lead ranger's expression hardened. "You expect us to believe that? Multiple witnesses say you pushed him with force. This wasn't an accident." The officer started, but his words faltered. He glanced toward Clarence, who was now chatting amiably with a small group of bystanders. There was something in the officer's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or something deeper. Whatever it was, he didn't elaborate, and the rangers pressed on with their interrogation. The crowd, though still buzzing with curiosity, began to disperse as the evening wore on. Families with children retreated to their cars, and the teens who had been filming quietly uploaded their videos, eager to be the first to share what was already being called the miracle at the Grand Canyon. Clarence, seemingly unfazed by all the commotion, eventually turned to leave. He moved slowly but steadily, his cane tapping softly against the ground. A young man hurried after him, his phone still recording. "Mr. Johnson," the man called. "Clarence, right? Can I ask, what's your secret? How did you survive that fall?" Clarence paused, glancing back with a gentle smile. "Now, if I told you all my secrets, young man, where would the fun be?" He gave a small wink before continuing on his way, leaving the young man standing there, both amused and baffled. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the canyon was bathed in a deep orange glow. The officer was escorted to a waiting vehicle, his face ashen and his hands shaking. The rangers exchanged uneasy dances, their investigation far from over. And yet, for all the questions swirling around the incident, one thing was clear. Clarence Johnson wasn't just an ordinary man. His survival defied logic, and his calm, almost playful demeanor only deepened the enigma. Later that night, as videos of the event spread across social media, theories exploded online. Some claimed Clarence was a professional climber who had trained for years. Others suggested he had hidden gear or was part of a staged performance. A few even speculated about supernatural explanations, dubbing him the man who couldn't fall. But Clarence himself didn't seem to care about the chatter. As he settled into his modest hotel room, he hummed softly to himself, his hands carefully polishing his cane. On the desk beside him was an old photo of a much younger Clarence standing on a mountain peak, a group of climbers cheering around him. He smiled at the memory before setting the photo down and glancing out the window. The night sky stretched endlessly, stars twinkling like tiny secrets waiting to be uncovered. Clarence leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Not bad for an old man," he murmured to himself, his voice carrying a hint of mischief. Whatever had happened that day at the Grand Canyon, one thing was certain. Clarence Johnson's story was far from over. Clarence sat in his hotel room, the night outside quiet except for the occasional hum of cars passing by. The day's events played in his mind like an old reel of film, vivid but surreal. He wasn't a man prone to dwelling on the past, but even he couldn't ignore the strangeness of what had transpired. Not the full, that part he could handle. It was the officer's face that lingered in his thoughts. That look of fear wasn't just about guilt. It was deeper, more personal. He leaned on his cane and stood, pacing slowly to the window. The dark canyon in the distance was barely visible under the starlit sky. It was beautiful, even haunting, but it didn't intimidate him. It never had. He'd spent years in places like this, learning their secrets, understanding the balance between risk and survival. But he'd left that life behind decades ago, trading it for a quieter existence. Or so he thought. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone on the nightstand. He shuffled back and picked it up, frowning at the unknown number on the screen. Clarence wasn't one for ignoring calls, though, so he answered with his usual warmth. "Good evening," he said. There was silence for a moment, and then a deep voice responded. "Mr. Johnson, you've had quite an eventful day." Clarence's grip on the phone tightened slightly. The voice was calm, but carried an undertone of authority, the kind that didn't come from a casual observer. "You could say that," Clarence replied carefully. "And who might I be speaking with?" "That's not important right now. What matters is what you've done, and what you've survived." The voice paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "You're a man full of surprises, aren't you?" Clarence chuckled, though his eyes narrowed as he glanced toward the window. "I like to think so, but I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific." The caller didn't laugh. The officer didn't push you out of clumsiness or malice. He was ordered to. And if you think today was an accident, you're mistaken. Clarence's breath hitched, but he quickly steadied himself. "Now, why would anyone want to do a thing like that?" "You tell me," the voice said. "You've made enemies in your time, Mr. Johnson. Some of them don't forget so easily." Before Clarence could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. The calm he displayed all day wavered as he considered the implications. Ordered? Enemies? He thought he left that life, those people, behind. But it seemed the past wasn't done with him yet. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Grant sat in an interrogation room at the park ranger station. His hands were clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. The lead ranger, Officer Keller, sat across from him, her eyes sharp as she studied his every move. "You're not telling us everything," Keller said bluntly. "What were you trying to accomplish out there?" Grant shook his head, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for him to fall. I swear, I was just following." He stopped abruptly, realizing he'd said too much. "Following what?" Keller pressed. "Orders. Whose orders?" Grant's jaw clenched. I don't know. It came through the department. Anonymous. They said he was dangerous, that he needed to be removed. But I didn't think they meant." "Removed?" Keller interrupted. "Clarence Johnson is a 78-year-old man. How could he possibly be dangerous?" Grant looked away, his shoulders sagging. "You don't understand. They said he wasn't what he seemed. That he was involved in something bigger than any of us." Keller frowned. "And you believe them?" Grant's laugh was bitter. "I didn't have a choice. You don't say no to these people. If you do, you disappear. And not like he did. For real." Back at the hotel, Clarence's thoughts turned to the past. He rarely spoke of his younger years, but they were etched into him, shaping the man he'd become. He'd spent time in places most people avoided, remote jungles, perilous mountains, hidden corners of the world where danger and wonder went hand in hand. There were whispers in those places, stories of power and knowledge that could change everything if they fell into the wrong hands. Clarence had walked away from it all, choosing a quiet life where he could help people without drawing attention to himself. But now, it seemed that choice was being ripped away. The fall wasn't the first warning. It was a test, and a message. Someone wanted him out of the picture, but they hadn't counted on his resilience. As the night deepened, Clarence packed a small bag, his movements deliberate. He didn't know who was behind this or why they'd chosen now to act, but he wasn't about to wait around to find out. He'd spent too many years preparing for moments like this to let fear paralyze him. Whatever was coming, he would face it head-on. At the same time, the videos of Clarence's fall continued to spread online, sparking debates and conspiracy theories. People analyzed every frame, searching for clues. Some pointed out the officer's aggressive behavior, demanding accountability. Others fixated on Clarence's miraculous survival, suggesting everything from hidden harnesses to divine intervention. A few, however, noticed something even stranger. In one of the videos, zoomed in and slowed down, Clarence's fall seemed to defy physics. His movements were almost too controlled, his body twisting at angles that shouldn't have been possible. It was subtle, but once seen, it was hard to ignore. In a dimly lit room somewhere far from the Grand Canyon, a group of figures watched the same footage on a large screen. Their faces were obscured, but their voices carried weight. "He's still alive," one of them said, his tone filled with frustration. "This complicates things." "Not necessarily," another replied. "It proves what we suspected. He's still as sharp as ever. But now he knows we're watching." "Then we proceed," a third voice said, cold and calculating. "No more half measures. If he won't stay out of the way, we'll make sure he doesn't have a choice." The room fell silent, the glow of the screen reflecting off shadowed faces. Whatever plan they had in motion, it was clear that Clarence Johnson was at the center of it, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The night felt heavier as Clarence stepped out into the chilled desert air. His small bag hung loosely over his shoulder, packed with only the essentials, things he might need if this turned into a long fight. The stars above twinkled faintly, offering no guidance, but Clarence wasn't looking for it. His instincts were sharp, honed by decades of experience, and those instincts told him he needed to keep moving. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching, they were waiting. For what, he didn't know, but he wasn't about to stand still and find out. As he walked toward his car, a faint sound caught his attention. A soft rustle, almost imperceptible against the whisper of the wind. Clarence paused, his grip tightening on his cane. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught the faintest glint of movement. Someone was there, watching him. "I know you're there," he called out, his voice calm but firm. "No sense hiding. Come on out." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a young woman, her face partially obscured by the hood of her jacket. She looked nervous but determined, her hands tucked deep into her pockets. Clarence studied her carefully, noting the way her shoulders were set, the way her eyes darted around the parking lot. "Who sent you?" he asked, his tone low but steady. "No one," she replied quickly, a little too quickly. "I came on my own. I saw the videos, the fall. I needed to find you." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "And why's that?" The woman hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. "Because I know what's happening to you. Or at least I think I do. They're after you, right? The same people who came after my dad." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and for the first time, Clarence saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just for him. It was personal. He relaxed his stance slightly but didn't let his guard down. "And who's your dad?" he asked. "Thomas Redding," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He worked in classified operations, said he knew too much. A few years ago, he started talking about people, organizations that wanted to keep certain truths buried. Then he disappeared. No explanation, no body, nothing." Clarence nodded slowly. He'd heard that name before, long ago in whispers and rumors during his own work in dangerous circles. Thomas Redding had been a man of integrity, someone who sought the truth no matter the cost. If this woman was his daughter, then she was likely telling the truth, or at least part of it. "And you think the same people are after me?" Clarence said, more as a statement than a question. The woman nodded. "They've been watching you for years. I don't know why, but they've been waiting for something. When you survived that fall today, it confirmed their suspicions. Whatever they're afraid of, you're it." Clarence didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned and glanced around the empty parking lot, his mind racing. If she was right, then today wasn't just a test. It was a signal. A declaration that the quiet life he tried to build was over. "Do you know what they want?" he asked finally, his voice calm despite the tension in the air. The woman hesitated again, clearly unsure how much to say. "Not exactly," she admitted. "But my dad used to say that there are things buried in this world, secrets that could change everything, and that people like them would do anything to keep those secrets hidden. He always said, it's not about what you know, it's about what they think you'll find." Clarence let out a quiet sigh. He'd spent his entire life trying to stay ahead of those shadows, never lingering too long in one place, never getting too close to anyone who might get hurt. But now it seemed they decided to come to him. Before he could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled both their attention toward the road. A black SUV was approaching, its headlights dim but deliberate. Clarence's stomach tightened. He didn't need to guess who it belonged to. "You need to go," he told the woman, his voice suddenly firm. "What?" "No," she protested. "I came to help you." "And you've done enough," Clarence replied, already moving toward his car. "But if you stay, you'll only make yourself a target. Trust me, you don't want to be in their crosshairs." The SUV came to a stop just a few yards away, its engine idling ominously. The doors opened, and 3 figures stepped out, dressed in plain black suits that were almost laughably conspicuous in the remote desert setting. They moved with precision, their faces expressionless. "Mr. Johnson," one of them called out, his voice cold and detached. "We need to have a word." Clarence didn't respond. Instead, he opened his car door and slipped inside, starting the engine in one smooth motion. The woman stood frozen, torn between fear and defiance. "Get in," Clarence said, his voice leaving no room for argument. She hesitated for only a second before diving into the passenger seat. Clarence hit the gas, the car lurching forward just as the men reached for something inside their jackets. There was no mistaking their intent now. As the car sped down the road, the SUV gave chase, its headlights looming in the rearview mirror. The tension inside the car was palpable, but Clarence's expression remained calm, his hands steady on the wheel. "What now?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. "Now," Clarence said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, "we see just how far they're willing to go." The car barreled down the winding road, the rumble of the tires blending with the relentless hum of the SUV behind them. Clarence kept his hands steady on the wheel, eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. The woman beside him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, clutched the door handle as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. "They're gaining," she said, her voice tight with panic. "I noticed," Clarence replied, his tone calm but laced with urgency. "Relax. This isn't my first chase." The SUV's headlights loomed closer, their glow cutting through the darkness like a predator closing in on its prey. Clarence's mind raced as fast as the car. He'd been in situations like this before, where the odds seemed insurmountable and escape felt impossible. But he also knew the importance of keeping his cool. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. The road veered sharply to the right, and Clarence took the turn hard, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The SUV followed, unwavering, and as it did, Clarence caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. One of the figures in the back seat was leaning out the window, something metallic glinting in their hand. "They're armed," Clarence said flatly, tightening his grip on the wheel. The woman's eyes widened. "What do we do?" "They'll shoot us." "They'll try," Clarence corrected. "But I don't make for an easy target." With a sudden jerk of the wheel, Clarence sent the car skidding onto a dirt path that veered away from the main road. The SUV followed, its heavier frame struggling slightly with the uneven terrain. Clarence used the momentary advantage to put some distance between them, the dust cloud from his tires obscuring their pursuer's vision. "You've done this before," the woman said, a mixture of awe and disbelief in her voice. Clarence glanced at her briefly, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Once or twice." The dirt path led them deeper into the desert, the landscape around them dark and unforgiving. But Clarence wasn't heading aimlessly. He had a destination in mind, a place he'd scouted years ago during one of his many explorations. If they could reach it, they might stand a chance. Just as the SUV began closing the gap again, something unexpected happened. From the other direction, another set of headlights appeared, heading straight toward them. Clarence's jaw tightened. Whoever these people were, they were better prepared than he'd anticipated. "Looks like they brought reinforcements," he muttered, his mind already calculating their next move. The woman looked back and forth between the approaching lights and Clarence, her voice rising. "We're trapped. They've boxed us in." "Not yet," Clarence said firmly. He scanned the terrain, searching for an opening, an opportunity. Then, just as the vehicles drew closer, he spotted it. A narrow gorge off to the side, its entrance hidden by a cluster of boulders. It wasn't a guaranteed escape, but it was better than waiting to be surrounded. "Hold on," Clarence warned, yanking the wheel hard to the left. The car veered off the dirt path, bouncing violently as it tore across the rocky ground. The woman let out a yelp, gripping the dashboard as the car squeezed through the narrow opening of the gorge. The SUV behind them hesitated for a moment, the drivers clearly debating whether to follow. But Clarence knew they wouldn't back down. Sure enough, the larger vehicle forced its way into the gorge, scraping its sides against the rock walls as it pursued them. The chase became even more treacherous, the path through the gorge twisting and uneven. Clarence navigated it with precision, his years of experience in hostile environments paying off. But as they rounded the sharp bend, he slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a sudden halt. "What are you doing?" the woman exclaimed, her voice filled with panic. "Trust me," Clarence said, his eyes fixed ahead. In the moonlight, the gorge opened into a wide, flat clearing surrounded by towering rock formations. It was a natural bottleneck, a place where they could make their stand. Clarence stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate, and motioned for the woman to stay inside. The SUV screeched to a halt a few yards away, its engine still growling. The doors opened, and the men in black suits stepped out, their expressions cold and unyielding. One of them held a firearm, the barrel glinting in the dim light. "You've got nowhere to run, Johnson," the man in the lead called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You can't outrun us, and you can't fight us. Make this easy on yourself." Clarence didn't move, his cane planted firmly in the ground. His eyes were sharp, unwavering. "You've come all this way," he said evenly. "So why did you tell me what you want?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "You know exactly what we want. The artifact, the location, everything you've been hiding all these years." Clarence's heart skipped a beat, though he didn't let it show. The artifact. He hadn't heard those words in decades, not since he'd left that life behind. But it all made sense now. The fall, the pursuit, the threats. They weren't after him. They were after what he knew. "I don't have it," Clarence said truthfully, "and even if I did, I wouldn't give it to you." The man's smile disappeared, replaced by a hard, dangerous expression. "Then you leave us no choice." Before Clarence could react, the man raised his hand, signaling the others. From the shadows, more figures emerged, dozens of them, all armed and closing in. The stakes had just been raised, and Clarence knew he was out of options. But even as the tension reached its breaking point, something unexpected happened. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the canyon, growing louder with each passing second. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the men in black exchanged uneasy glances. "What's happening?" The woman whispered from inside the car, her eyes wide with fear. Clarence didn't answer. He didn't know. But whatever was coming, it wasn't part of the plan, at least not theirs.